have BlinkLab, ticker code BB1, which stands poised to change the landscape of diagnosing and treating neurodevelopmental conditions like ASD and ADHD in children. To tell us more, please welcome Brian Leedman, Non-Executive Chairman at BlinkLab. Brian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Amber, and for the opportunity to present BlinkLab. So BlinkLab is an ASX listed company. We've been listed on the ASX for 2 years. We're all about early and accurate diagnosis of autism and ADHD. And when we're using smartphones to diagnose it using an objective testing, a digital biomarker in effect. Autism and ADHD is without doubt the two most topical subjects in the medical world, particularly in Australia. We're familiar with the NDIS and an enormous budget that we spend on that. It's actually approaching the cost of defence annually. In fact, over the next 3 years, it's actually predicted to surpass defence in terms of spending. So this is a pretty generous and program, but the number one cost within the NDIS is autism. And of course, in the United States and around the world, in Europe particularly, countries are spending enormous amounts of money for the early and accurate diagnosis of autism and ADHD and the costs associated with children and then adults living with it. Now, next slide. And next. This company, it's been around for 2 years. We had 150 million shares on issue. We did a significant capital raise, only our second capital raise since listing. That was only done about 10 days ago. We raised $17.5 million. That was cornerstoned by 2 very large investment funds. We now have almost $23 million in the bank. We're well funded. I always say in terms of the markets in the world, there's 2 types of ASX listed companies. There's those that have money and those that are needing to raise capital. We certainly now fall into the former category, which is important consideration in uncertain market times. And we also have an excellent board of directors led by myself, and I've got a lot of experience with a number of ASX listed healthcare companies, some of which have gone on to great success, including ResApp Health, which was acquired by Pfizer in September 22. We also have Dr. Hank-Jan Bolle, he's the co-founder and managing director, and also Dr. Anton Uvarov as another executive director. And Richard Hopkins is also a director and well experienced in that space. Next slide. So autism is a neurodevelopment condition that affects how the brain processes sensory information. We know how topical this subject is and the social impact that it has. And there's a lot of money being spent on managing and also diagnosing children with autism. It's a very complex disorder, and early diagnosis leads to early intervention. Early intervention leads to better outcomes. You can say that across the field of medicine in any disorder. Next. In terms of the facts and challenges, keep going, fill that slide, please. So the prevalence of autism is only going up. It's got a growth up to 3% now in the United States. This is a lot of kids having been diagnosed with autism. The prevalence only increases globally. Australia is definitely a hot center for autism, but the cost, the economic burden is just tremendous. And the US figures is $700 billion in 2024. And the lifetime cost is in the millions. There's a long wait list associated being able to see a psychiatrist. Of course, we know that in any specialist area, you need a general practitioner to make a referral to see a psychiatrist. And the problem is given the large amount of awareness of autism in society, particularly parents concerned about their children's development, the thing is that most of these, by far, almost all of them, there's nothing wrong with them. It's just a question of development rate, and not all kids develop at the same rates. But the GPs are obligated to send them up through the chain to see a specialist, a psychiatrist, for formal assessment, and that leads to many very long waiting times. And of course, the children is not being diagnosed until they say at least 2 years, mostly 3 or 4 years. And if they are in fact autistic, they're not getting any intervention whatsoever. And this is at that formative age of the child's development. So early diagnosis leads to better outcomes. And that's clearly the problem and the challenge associated with autism. Next, please. So what we lack in this field of medicine is there's no objective medical test for autism. There are, in fact, about 100 autism questionnaires that have been developed over many years. And these are all subjective testing. So that is the gold standard. It's really a doctor or a psychiatrist observing the child, adding up score markers and providing a score. And if it's autism, they can then place the child on the spectrum. That's how it's done. It's subjective testing. It's not perfect. It's not 100% accurate, but that's the standard. Next. And we know when the cost of NDIS is just in Australia, particularly $9.9 billion last year and only going up. So this is a big problem for governments in particular because they're the ones that are funding these programs. Next. So, as I mentioned earlier, early detection and diagnosis is crucial. And the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that children be screened for autism between the age of 18 and 24 months. That's the goal, but that's not possible because of this. I mentioned this long waiting list for a child to actually get a formal assessment, and they're not getting any intervention until they're formally assessed. Certainly, in the case of the NDIS, there's not one penny of support that goes to families with a child who's autistic until the child is actually diagnosed as autistic. And that means no intervention. And we also know that early intervention is very cost effective because these children then go on to becoming adults. And while they're children, they're living in the care of their family and home. So the cost is still large, but not as large as when the child becomes independent as an adult. And then there's home care costs, and that is really where the costs of NDIS just spiral. So early diagnosis leads to early intervention and much better outcomes when they become adults. And that is where the cost savings come in, something for governments, a subject they're very, very aware of and very concerned about globally. Next. Now, this little slide, we'll just make that play in the background while I'm talking. And now you can't, there's no real noise associated with this. There would be otherwise, but unfortunately I can't show that. But this just demonstrates to you how simple this test is. It's about 10 minutes. The child is watching a cartoon effectively. It's in the case, I think it's Toy Story. But while they're watching it, they're getting hit with a bunch of visual and audio and visual stimuli. And what it's doing is actually making the child's blink or facial reflex responses, and how they blink or how they respond is actually where the smarts in this technology actually comes from. So they're getting in this case a very loud impulse into their ears and it makes them blink, but their reaction time to the impulse measured in milliseconds is where this all the magic is in the algorithms that we've developed and through AI machine learning. So we're using an objective digital biomarker to assess a neurological condition in a person's brain. And that's effectively what BlinkLab does. So let's move it to the next slide and just go again. So what you see here is that child just blinked. Now, the reason why he blinked, and he's a neurotypical child, there's nothing wrong with this child whatsoever, but when they got that stimuli and the child would blink, every single person would do exactly the same thing. Now, what we're doing next, let's go to the next slide. We're going to do a double beep. You see the double beep at the top of the screen? Now, what happened then was interesting. The child did not blink. Now, this is slowed down to slowed down from a second. So we're slowing this down, but there's 1,000 milliseconds to a second. And what we're doing is giving two beeps that are back to back, a soft beep and a loud beep, but only 30, 40 milliseconds apart. And what happens in a neurotypical person is they do not blink. Now let's move to the next slide and move to someone who's autistic. Single beep, single blink, as you can see there. And that's very normal response. Let's go to the next one with a double beep. Now there's the double beep. Did you notice the child blinked again? Now that's an interesting thing. Now there's papers that go back 100 years talking about this pre-pulse inhibition test. We didn't invent this, but what we have done is taken this type of technology and put it onto a smartphone. And the fact that that child blinked with the double beep tells us that this child is autistic. And potentially we can even place the child on the spectrum based on his reaction to this test. Now, there's another thing about girls. Girls are very good at masking the symptoms of autism, very hard to diagnose subjectively. There is no difference, male or female, in this test. So you cannot cannot hide this thing. This is an objective digital biomarker for autism. Next slide. And fill that screen. Perfect. So we are using a neuroscience on a smartphone. Minuscule facial reflexes evoked by our app generate a digital biomarker for autism. Invokes the facial reflex, and this is how we're doing it all on the smartphone, used by the learning and the algorithms on the smartphone. More importantly, the forward-facing camera is analyzing the child's face. Now, by the way, this works on people of any age. We just see the biggest commercial opportunity in children. Again, early diagnosis leads to better outcomes. Next slide, please. So this research that we're doing is being published. This is very important for investors to know, that if you're going to do something like this, you want to know that this thing is actually even approvable, and you want the FDA to see and be aware of the articles that are published in scientific journals. And in this case, this is a recent article published on the 30th of October 2025. It was published in Autism Research magazine's the most prestigious magazine in the space for autism research, as the name would evoke. And you can see some of the names of the authors, and Anton Uvarov I can see there, and Hank Yamboli, amongst others. So we are being published, and that's an important consideration for the FDA when we actually do go to FDA approval. Next. Now, we're not just looking at blinks. I'm only talking blinks here because blinks is just an easy way to explain it. It is an important part of it, but there's also screen avoidance, head rotations, posture, moving of hands. There's lots of things that go into this algorithm to make it as accurate as it is. Next. Now, we have a performance ceiling of 85 to 90%. The reason for that, for those astute in the audience will know that we're comparing ourselves to an subjective test, which is not 100% accurate. It's pretty accurate, but not 100%. So we can never be 100% accurate ourselves due to the subjectivity of the test that we're comparing ourselves to. So just to give you an idea in terms of what can be expected in doing the clinical trials that we're doing. Next. Now, there are a couple of companies that are doing something somewhat similar to us. There's Cognoa and ETD. Now, they're both US private companies. They both raised in excess of $400 million. And as you can see from the results, they're nowhere near as accurate as BlinkLab. We have a sensitivity specificity score of 84, 85% respectively. Cognoa is a de novo, which means it was a first in class. That's important because it means that technology such as this is approvable by the FDA. ETD is also FDA approved, but they went down the 510K route, which means that there's a predicate device in the case here at Cognoa. BlinkLab will also be an application for 510K, but as you can see, our results are far superior to Cognoa and ETD. ETD is better than Cognoa, but the problem is they're not using smartphone-based technology. They're using high-speed cameras set up in a hospital room and focused on a child's face. Yes, a similar sort of technology that we're using, but there's no scalability in it because it's not a smartphone-based tech. Next. So just fill that screen. Excellent. So this is the most important slide. It shows here that we just completed a pilot study of 485 children in the United States. We achieved this 84, 85% sensitivity specificity. That's compared to a subjective test by a psychiatrist. So it's amazing to think that a smartphone such as this can achieve such accuracy compared to the formal subjective diagnosis. And the FDA knows that it can't be a perfect test because we're comparing ourselves to something that's imperfect. So they specified that we need to hit a threshold of 65% or greater to get FDA approval. So we're sitting greatly above that. And by the way, 485 kids, that's a big study. That means that the result was statistically powered. Next. Now for the big one, which is the FDA main trial, the 510K submission trial. We've only just announced the start of that trial. It's going to be another 500 odd kids. And you can see from the centers that we're working with that we have the most prestigious centers of autism research in the world, and specifically here in the United States for this study. Centers like the Kennedy, Vanderbilt Institute of Autism Research, and the Seattle Children's Hospital, and so forth. What an amazing eclectic group of hospitals that we're using to recruit those patients. And by the way, that's important also post FDA approval, because they will become the centers that will champion the technology and be adopted by the psychiatric community worldwide. So this is a very important thing that we're doing, and we will read out the results of this trial by the end of this calendar year. Next. Yeah. So just go back one. So it's intended as a diagnostic aid for clinicians. So there's an important differentiation here, because I get asked a lot, when can parents be able to use this for themselves, for their child? That's not going to happen. The reason is because this is a diagnostic aid. It has to be a diagnostic aid if you want the product to be approved by the FDA. They don't like Dr. Google. They certainly wouldn't like this being in the hands of parents just to be able to diagnose their children themselves. This has to be a tool to assist a GP, a doctor in this case, to diagnose this, to be able to refer to a specialist. Now, you can imagine with the long waiting times, if this is used as a screening test, and it can be as a low-cost screening test rolled out to millions of children born and in the young ages every year across the world, this can generate huge sums of money as a FDA-approved screening test, so that you can cut out that long waiting time for all the children that are on the waiting list. Really shouldn't be there, because they develop at different speeds. The prevalence of autism is only 3%. So there's no reason why you should have such a long waiting list to see a psychiatrist. This is the solution to that problem. Next. Now, this is my favorite slide. What we have here is the scientific basis for why BlinkLab could become an enormous company. And you can see there, when I described the double beep earlier with the young children, the soft sound followed by the loud sound. In the control group, you can see that there's no blinking response. That's a control group. We call that neurotypical. For the autism, you'll notice on the screen that the blink response is actually on the second louder beep for people with autism. They're blinking on the second louder beep. But for ADHD, they're blinking on the first softer sound. Now, that is a clear differentiation between autism and ADHD using our technology. Now, what I love about that is that autism is obviously a big opportunity, but the ADHD market opportunity is 5 or 6 times larger in terms of prevalence in society. There's also a class of drugs approved to treat ADHD. I'm sure you would have heard of them. Drugs like Ritalin, amphetamine-based drugs. They're highly competitive space for big pharma. They've all got their own different drugs to treat ADHD. So if you have a technology such as ours that's FDA approved, used by a GP, then potentially you can diagnose children with ADHD, or even adults. And if the app is owned by the big pharma, then they can recommend a certain drug to the dispensing doctor. Now, that is a clear market opportunity for BlinkLab in a market where there's already a class of drugs approved, and it's a multi-billion-dollar market. And it's the exact same product. We're not developing anything different. It's the same product, but to be used for ADHD in addition to autism. I'm pleased to say that now that we have this capital raise behind us and $23 million in the bank, we've got more than enough money to then run an ADHD trial in the US concurrently with our autism study. And I do not believe there's any value associated in our current share price with the ADHD market opportunity. So that's probably the biggest leave behind for the audience today about where we're going to do, what we're going to do this year. Pretty exciting stuff. Next. So there's the design of our trials. So you can see the autism one is already commenced. The ADHD one is planned to commence soon in this year. And this is a lot of news flow. There's no phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. We're talking about an FDA regulatory study. There's just the one trial. There's no safety risk in using our product. It's not like a drug. You have to prove safety. You do have to demonstrate efficacy, however, and that's what we're doing. And we're well funded to do so. And you will see in the course of this year a number of the most exclusive, prestigious hospitals specializing in ADHD joining our trial for the ADHD trial in concurrency with our autism trial, which has already begun and will read out by the end of this year. Next. Our commercialization strategy, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be firstly adopted by autism specialists. These are the centers that are participating in the trial. However, the final goal really is as a screening test. That's our goal. If it could be used as a screening test, a low cost, call it a couple of $100, you compare that to the thousands and thousands of dollars associated with doing a formal subjective diagnosis. This could be a low cost test that could be rolled out to all children to diagnose for autism or ADHD at a very young age. Of course, in most cases, by far, or almost all the cases, they'll come back as neurotypical, but we will capture those that have autism or ADHD using this low cost objective test that can be scaled out, rolled out globally with smartphones. The parents are doing the test on the child, but the diagnosis is going to the GP. And then that is how we control that process, and that would be the approval process for the FDA. Next. Now, we did announce something very, very big. I was so surprised to see this announcement. It was only a couple of weeks ago, but the government of Morocco has decided to roll this technology out across their entire country of 40 odd million people to test their 600,000 children annually using our technology as a screening test for autism. And we're not even regulatory approved yet. I mean, I've never heard of such a thing. It's quite remarkable. This is a government that has rolled this out. And I think this will be an example of other countries that will roll this out, not necessarily before we're FDA approved. This is really quite unusual. But post FDA approval, I can see this being rolled out and scaled by countries because it's the countries' governments that are spending so much money on healthcare, particularly for autism and ADHD. They are going to be the ones that will benefit in terms of the costs associated with this significant problem. And so this is quite an amazing thing, and I was very proud to see that announcement just a couple of weeks ago. Next. Okay, so my last slide. We're not just working on autism ADHD. I mean, that's where our money is being spent, but we do have a number of collaborations. You can see there with Mental Care Group, Erasmus University Hospital in the Netherlands, the Magnus study at Monash in Melbourne, and the European Adult Study in Amsterdam. So this is a platform technology. It's not just autism and ADHD. This technology can be used to diagnose a whole range of things. And you can see in these studies that these are not things that we're paying for. These are collaborations with major parties that see the benefit of using this as a platform technology to diagnose other things, call it dementia. I'd like to see a study perhaps done in, say, depression. These are all things that are currently all diagnosed subjectively, but if you can find that signal using our smartphone test that can then, there's a biomarker, an objective biomarker that can diagnose, say, dementia or depression and so forth. These are enormous market opportunities and something that we're very proud to be partnering with such prestigious groups. So with that, I thank you very much for your time. And BlinkLab, as I say, is ASX listed. We perform very well. But I do think, just in closing, that the news flow that we have to come really puts in paid to the news flow that we've had to date, because we are now at the very business end with these FDA clinical trials. The autism study that completes by the end of this calendar year, the ADHD trial is going to commence shortly and then complete by the middle of next year. Both enormous markets and very disruptive technology, and very proud of my entire team. And also thank our shareholders for their support. And for those that are prospective investors, I certainly welcome you on the register. Thank you for your time.